My name is Andres Zapata. I'm a doctoral student in UX at the University of Baltimore, and I'm here with my advisor, professor, and friend, Dr. Deborah Call. Together, we've put together this presentation for you guys. We both have other jobs outside of what we do at the University of Baltimore. I run a small studio here in Baltimore called ID5, and Deb is a consultant for the government in this type of work. Deb, you want to say anything before we get going?
No, the only thing I want to say is one of the things Andres and I have discovered over working together for the past couple of years is how very much having some basic knowledge of brain function actually does have a significant effect in improving some of our design issues. And we wanted to share that with everybody today.
Awesome. Let's dive in. So again, Deb and Andres, want to take you guys down a quick journey of how enrollment works, generally speaking, from an advertisement point of view. We create ads, we place the ads in market through some sort of targeting strategy. Those ads cost money, so you want to make sure that you have a good ad with a good targeting strategy in market. Those ads should point people to designated landing pages or marketing landing pages where you'll find a request for information or an RFI form. Every time somebody clicks ads, they cost money, so you want to make sure that they're good and that they're sending people to the right place. On a landing page, the job for that landing page is to actually take those eyeballs and that traffic and convert them into leads, which then are nurtured through some sort of a lead nurture process, email, phone calls, on-campus visits, so on. And the hope is that eventually those leads will convert into enrollments. And that's basically the holy grail in enrollment. This is John Wanamaker. He's credited for being one of the forefathers of modern day advertising. And he was known for having said something to the effect of half of his advertising investments are wasted. He just doesn't know which half. And that's generally because by and large, advertising in his age were basically scattershot, not very focused ways to get awareness and drive performance. That has changed a lot since digital media arrived in the scene about 20 years ago, but it's still very expensive, and a lot of the media that we use is wasted by and large, especially when the targeting strategy is not right and when the landing pages are not perfectly tuned. So just to show you real quick that this topic is an important one because a lot of money is being spent on digital media in the US. This is just the US, so you can imagine that being monumentally bigger worldwide. But that's $107 billion as of 2018 per year for digital advertising, which is an incredible amount of money. And it's only growing. So this stuff matters. And really what we're trying to get here is, can we, through some minor design adjustments, improve the performance of those designated landing pages such that we can get more out of that specific traffic that we're getting from the money that we're spending on those advertisements. So here are two scenarios that we put together for you. They're basically identical, where you have 50,000 impressions at a 2% conversion rate. You get about 1,000 clicks. If 5% of those 1,000 people convert, you get 50 leads. And if 20% of those leads convert to apps, you will likely end up with one enrollment. If we apply new RFIs or the landing pages, we can expect to improve the performance of that by to 20%, sometimes even to 30%, just recapitalizing or basically increasing the yield on that traffic that you have already invested on. So the impressions and the clicks are the same, which means you have the same overall investment going in. But if you look all the way to the right on the enrollments went up just because the RFIs or those designated landing pages were converting people more actively. And that's what this presentation is about. How can we calibrate our designs such that we can get the most out of that advertising investment that we've been making? And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we have to do this quickly. The brain makes very, very fast decisions in less than 50 milliseconds, which is the 20th of a second. The brain is making decisions of like, no like, which then translate over to trust, no trust. And that's incredibly fast. But what's most terrifying about this is that immediately after that, the brain starts looking for evidence to confirm the decision that it made or the feeling that it had. This is known as confirmation bias, and it's really scary because it will actively look for evidence to support the feeling or the assessment, and it will actively ignore evidence against the contrary. So we really have one shot, a very, very fast shot, to make sure that from that click to that landing page, we make the right impression so that we can capitalize on that investment. So to do that, we thought it would be really important to first dive into the biology of the brain so that we can understand some components of it and how they work. So Dr. Cole is going to tell us about the frontal lobe.
Yeah, the frontal lobe of your brain is the part of the brain that supports what we call the executive functions: attention, monitoring, decision making, persistence, deciding to take action, all the things that you think you're doing on purpose. But the reason we're emphasizing it right at the very beginning of our presentation is that a lot of the work that's being done in this environment has a target audience of folks under the age of 25. And one of the things that brain scientists know very certainly is that the brain doesn't fully mature until your early to late 20s. It's particularly late for males. Women's brains tend to mature around the age of 21, men around the age of 26. And by mature, we mean myelinate. And myelin is a tissue in the brain that insulates axons so that your brain can function in its most effective way. Myelination becomes an issue because the immature brain is a brain that does not pay attention well, that has trouble monitoring its environment, that is not an effective decision maker, that needs external cues to persist at tasks, and needs extra prods to actually take action or take behavior. So a lot of the users for these sites are folks whose brains are still growing up. Therefore, the site itself will get better performance if it provides some of the structure that promotes good executive function. We can go to the next slide. The other part of the brain that's of interest is the limbic system. This is a more primitive set of structures in the brain. And these brain structures are the things that support our emotional reactions to things, our motivation to do things, and our impulses to take action. The immature cortex interacts with the limbic system in a peculiar way that gives the limbic system dominance. So you will drive your behavior based on an emotion. You will have an impulse and not be able to suppress it. You will be motivated to do something and not know why. So the immature, not fully myelinated frontal lobe is more dominated by these not conscious necessarily, and certainly not logical things that come from the more primitive part of our brain. So we have a user who's going to be primarily affected by these more primitive impulses, emotions, and motivations, and less able to consciously and intentionally drive their behavior using their rational self. So we have a tension between frontal limbic connections. We have a tension between the emotional self and the rational self. And in the user group, especially folks under the age of 25, the emotional self carries more weight than the rational self. So our design parameters need to take that into account so that we can provide more support for the rational self and a little bit of braking systems on the emotional self. We can go to the next slide. The neurotransmitters are the chemicals in the brain that permit the brain to function, sending messages from one neuron to another neuron. And the two in particular that we're interested in that are involved in these frontal limbic kinds of interactions are serotonin and dopamine. Both of these neurotransmitters have effects on mood, and both of them have effects on motivation. And primarily, they make for more positive moods and increased levels of motivation. And later on in our presentation, we'll talk specifically about types of behaviors that increase dopamine function in particular, which result in more persistent behavior when someone's interacting with your website. Next slide. Andres. Me? Okay. So when we move from pure biology now to more functional neuroanatomy, more cognitive kinds of things, what we have to notice about the human brain is, first of all, human beings are visually dominant. We have a big old hunk of the brain called the occipital lobe that does nothing but process visual information. So if there is information coming into more than one of your senses, whatever is coming in visually will be what you attend to first and what you give the most credibility to. And a lot of the things that we do in web design are based to capitalize on this visual dominance. And I'm going to turn it over to Andres to talk about the conventions that are built on this.
Right. So what we thought we would do is, as we cover some of these principles and some of these ideas, we'd give you examples of them in action. So this is the landing page for the Dornsife School of Public Health. They have some things that they've done well here and some things that could be improved. One of the most important things that we just talked about was this idea of conventions. The most important thing that we can do right now as we design websites is to understand the conventions that people are used to. They build mental models as to how things are supposed to work. And it's our job to follow those mental models and not violate them, because as they are accessing and leveraging those models, they are then freed up to focus on other things, such as the content on this page. One of the conventions that is important to follow is the logo. For instance, it should always be on the upper left-hand corner, and it should behave like a logo. There's also this idea of a form, and the form needs to be visible, and it should be clearly delineated from the rest of the page itself. With visual dominance, it's important to make sure that you're pulling the eye to the right place. So one very interesting method that we use to see where the eye is being pulled after we're done designing something is to squint at the design itself. I'm sure many of you have done this before, but if you're to squint at this, your eye should be pulled to the yellow parts of the screens, and that's where the form is. The other thing that will pull your eye is the capitalization, the bolding, the visual hierarchy, the spacing, and all of those elements working together are going to direct the eye and the attention to where we want them to be.
And one of the powerful things about employing these conventions, because we have experienced users who expect to see things in certain places when they interact with a website, is if you violate the expectation, if you don't follow the convention, you actually create a negative emotional reaction in that limbic system. A violation of expectation creates a reaction of anger or frustration, and that then results in communication with the frontal lobe that this is not a pleasant experience, and your user may likely abandon the site, stop doing the task, and never come back because they've had a negative emotional reaction. So we certainly want to avoid violation of expectation in our design parameters. One of the other things that we do that is a convention is we capitalize on schemas. Schemas are people's mental models of how the world is supposed to work. So they will already know what to do because we are presenting information to them in a way that is familiar and that fits in with their prior experiences, and they will know to expect a certain thing to happen next. That is, these things are sort of unconscious and not in the person's awareness, but very powerful, because if a schema has been formed that a certain thing should be happening a certain way and it doesn't happen that way, again, we run the risk of violation of expectation. But one other little wrinkle that comes into our way of looking at this from our knowledge of the brain is that the human brain is hardwired to perceive the world in particular ways. We've developed and evolved over the millennia to want to organize our experiences. And some of these organizational principles are called Gestalt principles. That comes from perceptual psychology. But basically, we try to make things meaningful. We try to make things whole. We fill in the blanks. We use our schemas to let us make predictions about what will happen next. And if we can design our pages to take into account our biological tendency to organize the world in certain ways, we can free up our user to concentrate on the more effortful or the more intentional parts of the task that they're engaged in with our site.
So some of the Gestalt principles is figure ground. In this example, we have the yellow again as the figure ground, and the user is able to very quickly and effortlessly differentiate between two things, allowing the brain to focus on a particular thing and then begin that decoding process. Another example of a Gestalt principle is grouping. So things that are together tend to be known to be together, and that's an automatic, instantaneous thing that happens. So the association of information using hierarchy and spacing is a really important thing to signal to the user without any effort that all of that information is related. And so by scanning, they're able to quickly skip a chunk of information if it doesn't answer or meet the need that they might have at any given point in time. Another example of schema is how we understand dates, right? So there's nothing telling us here that that's the month pull down, the day pull down, or the year pull down. However, we know what to expect when we pull on those things, and a violation of that, of that sequence, of that schema, of that understanding, is going to really upset your user and get them to feel things that are not productive towards getting them to the end result.
One of the peculiar things about the human brain and human behavior in particular is that although we have a great deal of capacity in terms of our ability to learn and remember things, we have very limited ability to actually pay attention. And the limitations to attention extend to the number of things we're trying to pay attention to, and also the length of time during which we're going to focus our attention. So we're very limited. We, however, have two attentional systems, biologically, two attentional systems. One is called effortful. That's the one where you're trying to pay attention to something. And the other one is automatic. And that's the one that evolved earlier that sort of lets you keep tabs on your environment so the tigers don't eat you. One of the things that happens to us in this day and age is we forget about the power of monitoring, that form of attention that you're not doing on purpose, that is allowing you to keep track of important things in your environment. The monitoring system takes into account time, when things happen in time, where things happen in space, how frequently things happen, and how familiar things are. So these are all cues that let you sort of hold on to what's going on in your environment and then shift the focus of your limited attention to the new thing or the changed thing or the thing that you currently need to focus on in the moment. If we can manipulate our design elements to feed into the types of perceiving that people are hardwired to do, to remove pressure from the effortful and attentional system, so do as many things as we can using automatic monitoring mechanisms, we're more likely to allow the person to focus their limited attentional capacity on the tasks that we would like them to complete. So, Andres.
So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you're deciding how much content to add to a page, because every single word, every single animation, every single image, every single picture, every single thing that you put on that page adds to the cognitive load that the user is carrying as they process that page. So what we want to do as designers is to limit the amount of information that we put on the page to manage the cognitive load. In many cases, we can't limit that information for whatever reasons. In this case, the form itself could not be submitted by the system could not receive the data from this form unless all of this data is entered. It is how it was programmed, how their CRM was configured, and that was a contributing factor to how many form fields there are on this page. However, if in an ideal world, we'd want to have as few form fields as possible so that it doesn't look too complex, so that you are managing that attention in the places that matter the most and in a way that is most successful for the user. when you don't have control of how much information goes on the page, that's when you rely on your other design tools, such as progressive disclosure, where you hide things until the user needs it, at which point you're exposed to complexity. Chunking, where you group information together using hierarchy, spacing, lines, color, so on and so forth. And those are some of the, and you can also do loading or time loading to help users manage when and how they see the information that's presented to them, so that they are managing their own cognitive load as they process the information that's on this page.
Another area where we have to deal with human constraints is in working memory. And working memory is just the label of everything that's going on in your mind at any particular point in time. And we know that our working memory capacity is fairly limited. One of the things that happens in brain stuff is we try to take advantage of the types of stimuli that people tend to process with the least amount of effort, with the least amount of capacity. And we come into a big conflict between things that are words and things that are images. And the conflict is this: when a human being who knows how to read sees a display that has words in it, the first thing they will try to do is read the words. So we have to work really hard to divert their attention away from that tendency to read the words, if indeed we want them to do something else first. Images are powerful, and images are more easily remembered than words, but words grab attentional capacity and words eat up memory capacity. So I would like you to go to the application slide, Andres, and then we'll come back to the notion of incomplete task cost, because we need to look at the application of working memory here.
So looking at this, we are asking the user to keep a lot in short-term and working memory, especially if they're reading through all of this information. The thing to do here would be to make sure that the hierarchy is strong, and so that people can have the ability to quickly scan and move on from one place to the other, and not necessarily retain the information that they're reading in working memory. The idea here is to emotionally get them to commit to providing the information and then guiding them to the place where that information is being collected, so that they don't necessarily have to keep the information in working memory to complete the form itself, to complete the task. Go ahead.
Well, and then that takes us to the task completion issue. In a situation like this, where there's actually a lot of information that needs to be typed into the form, there could be any number of reasons why that task might not be completed. One, we could have violated expectations about something. For instance, this form asks for a lot of personal information, and a casual applicant may not understand the relevance of that information and may choose not to complete the form. Or there's a lot of information on these pages and people are easily distracted. Something could have happened in the environment or in the person's own head that distracts them from completing this task. That neuroscience has shown us is that task completion, actually finishing something, leads to little bursts of dopamine, which leads to little increases in how good you feel about what's going on. And the more little bursts of dopamine you get, the more likely you are to like what you're doing, to persist with what you're doing, and to complete what you're doing. If you are disrupted for whatever reason and do not complete the task, we've learned two things that are a little scary, because they could go either way. An incompleted task causes a degree of anxiety and attention residue. So some of your limited capacity, your limited attention capacity, is still stuck on that task that you haven't finished, making you less effective for whatever it is you're doing next. And an uncompleted task also leads to a negative emotional reaction and a drop in dopamine. Your dopamine levels actually do drop when you leave things incomplete. So this drop in dopamine can unfortunately, drop in dopamine, but also better remembering. You remember the task better. So you're going to remember that you didn't finish it, and it's going to make you feel bad. And this can result in a user simply avoiding returning to the site and avoiding returning to complete the task because of the negative emotional connotation. And in an immature nervous system, in a frontal lobe that's not fully myelinated, that emotional impulse will override any logical decision making that might occur about why it might be important to finish that form. So we have to be really careful about unintended consequences with these emotional reactions in our immature brain, our users with immature brain. Andres?
So when we think about motivation, it comes in two forms, generally speaking, from within and from outside. As we talk about recruitment, we have to think about what type of recruitment we're trying to achieve. Is it undergraduate? Is it graduate? Because understanding that gives us a better perspective of who the user is and how their brains might be working. For example, undergraduates might be younger and are likely, their brains, their frontal lobes are likely less mature or myelinated than if you are an older student going for a graduate or doctoral program. And the motivation for an undergraduate student might be from the outside. It might be its parents or her counselor or her friends putting the motivation or the pressure on them to go ahead and find out more or apply to a college. Whereas graduate students, the motivation to find out more or apply might be coming from within and their own internal drives to learn more and to become more. So when you think about both motivation from within and from without, it actually maps over to both the limbic system and the frontal cortex in very interesting ways. And as you move through that, it releases neurotransmitters that support or advance the initial motivation instinct that we have. So for example, an older student is probably going to be more motivated by outcomes, long-term outcomes. So in this case, in this example, maybe images of a practicing public health professional are what are going to speak to this audience, is what's going to motivate them more so than maybe someone in a classroom or someone writing a paper or someone in a quad, where the experience, the short-term outcome of the process is what's going to motivate a younger student. So as we think through motivation itself, it really does drive what kind of images and copy or language we use here. Really understanding your user, their age group, and their motivation should drive the calibration or the image and copy selection that we use on these forms and these pages.
Can we go back just one quick minute to slide the number 5, one more back? Because we just need to quickly mention delayed versus immediate gratification. The immature brain really requires immediate gratification. And one of the things we noticed about this current website, which is the next slide, is that the student information form does provide subtle cues to the accuracy and completeness of the task. Like when you fill in one of the boxes, the colors change and there's a subtle change in hue. What we saw here with this website was sort of a missed opportunity to provide immediate feedback to each response, which is immediate gratification of the behavior, which motivates the person to continue to persist in the behavior. And so I just wanted to make sure we stuck that in there. We can go forward now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, and you don't want to hit people over the head with a lot of messaging and back and forth. I think subtle, elegant touches that show that it worked, that what you just did worked, are important here. And also, conversely, if it didn't work, a subtle real-time response of, you might want to adjust this with language that's approachable, friendly, and helpful. as you move through the form itself instead of waiting until you hit submit to see what happens.
Which brings us to the final point. Almost all the time, behavior is more prevalent, more frequent, more persistent if it is reinforced constantly. So for every little behavior, there's a little bit of reinforcement. Every little bit of reinforcement is actually increases dopamine and serotonin, the happy neurotransmitters that keep you more interested in continuing the behavior. If you want a behavior to persist beyond just the immediate time period, you can switch your reward schedules around. There's all kinds of research on different schedules of rewarding somebody for doing something. But the takeaway for this particular message is that feedback is so important, particularly when you're dealing with immature brains, because it allows for the person to continue to feel good about what they're doing, have the impulse continue, maintain the motivation, complete the task. So we cannot. It's wise for all of us to build feedback opportunities into everything that we design that capitalizes on visual dominance and on the word superiority effect.
And I would say that the feedback in this case, as we're talking about it here, pertains to two different types. One is as you're moving through the experience, subtle nudges or acknowledgments or encouragements along the way, and the ultimate feedback at the end of the task, confirming, most importantly, that what they set out to do has been completed. But also, as important is a sense of expectation framing. What comes next? What can I expect to see? What can I expect to hear? And then thirdly, don't let it be a dead end. Don't let it just end right there with a thank you, period. Know your audience and know what might be the next step in their journey, and take that opportunity to guide them in any way you can to that next step. So maybe they're a graduate student who showed interest in a particular program. Maybe there's a blog or a social media property, or maybe there is an open house or a video that corresponds to that particular program that they're interested in, that you can connect that for them right there and then on that confirmation page. Us to continue that journey in a positive trajectory. You will not have them be more interested in this program for a while than at that time when they just got done completing that information submission process. So take advantage of that dopamine burst that they just received, because they got the task is done, and ride that dopamine wave into the next path or the next step in that path to advance and begin that nurture process. This page here, it does show errors, which is a form of feedback. The way that the errors are being handled here are not necessarily the best way to do it, simply because the error is coming all at once, but they're not all very helpful. And it's using red, which is alarming, and the language itself is not giving you a sense of how to correct the mistakes that were made. So another way to handle this is by, if there's an error on the form, give the people feedback as they're typing it in, or give them hints about what type of information you're looking for so that they can do it right the first time. All right, so we went through a lot of information very, very quickly because we wanted to leave at least 5 minutes for questions and answers. We've left about 7 minutes, so I think that's good. Any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or objections for us?
We have 3 questions in the chat, so I will go through and pass the first one on to y'all. The question is, this audience member heard earlier in the session that male brains mature later than women. They were asking for a clarification on that. At what age do male brains mature?
It is a range, and everybody is a little bit different, but most of the research suggests that male brains are fully myelinated at around age 26 or 27.
And women are
Women tend to myelinate earlier, between the ages of 19 and 21.
and then we're saying that myelination is maturation.
Myelination is correlated with complete and efficient brain function. So the mature execution of those executive functions, like thinking and problem solving and planning and suppressing impulses and all that good stuff, you're doing all of that with an immature brain, but you're not necessarily doing it as well as you might be, particularly when it comes to self-initiating behavior and self-control.
Okay, great. Another question that was received in the chat function was, how do you wrestle violations versus evolutions of design parameter expectations?
Can you say that again? How do you
wrestle or negotiate the violations versus an evolution of design parameter expectations?
That's a really good question. I'm going to reframe it a little bit so that I make sure that I'm answering the right question. There are conventions, and you have to know the conventions in order to better connect with users' expectations and to help them complete the task more successfully. If I'm understanding the question right, understanding those conventions is important to task completion. But what happens with the brain is that when they're leveraging conventions, they're almost on autopilot to an extent, and they may not be paying attention to the detail as much as we would want them to. Or they might not be registering particular things as much as we would want them to, us to remember those things. So when you have to break convention, I would say always break convention when you want to slow the user down and make them think about what they're doing. If you want them to remember, or if you want them to be more deliberate, break convention. But for most things, like a switch or a button or things that are fairly common and expected, I would only break convention there if you absolutely need to. But otherwise, I would adhere to those conventions.
Okay, perfect. We received another question in the Q&A section. This question says, you spoke a lot to visual design and how it relates to design. Have you done any research into how those who are visually impaired interact with similar designs?
Yes, but we have to be careful about how we're defining visually impaired. It is a whole different world if somebody who is totally blind is interacting with something, because we don't have the same sets of parameters for communicating information tactilely or using auditory kinds of information. If we're talking about somebody who can see but just not see very well, the research suggests that what we end up in that situation is simply information overload at a lot lower level of information than we can take for granted in someone who has quotes around this normal vision. So the research that's been done on low vision users suggests that the modifications actually benefit all users. So maybe we should take advantage of them as well. But it has to do with the amount of information on the page, whether it is verbal information or nonverbal information, and then whether or not you supplement that information with auditory input. So we're balancing off multiple sensory presentation of information with the amount of information that can be expressed, and then the limitations on attention. So it's a lot more complicated. But the takeaway, the bottom line of it is simply reduce the amount of information that is required at any point in time when the person's processing the information on the site. Just smaller amounts of information are more effective for visually impaired folks.